Okay, it's time. I'm doing it. I've been putting it off because the next 2 hours of reading on this book is going to be a bunch of commie gobbledygook, but we're going to do it. All right, so welcome back to our Let's Read series on the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. Remember, this is not intended to be an audiobook performance. This is intended to be me reading the book and providing you commentary, rebuttals, additional arguments, etc. So if that's your thing, you're welcome. You're welcome to come on in. If that's not your thing, and you just want to read the book, go buy the audiobook from Michael. I think he reads it himself. So let me get chat up here so I can see you guys. I'm a little unprepared today, but that's fine. A lot going on today. All right, I have chat up. What's up, everybody? Good to see y'all. Not Spooner time. We're on chapter 12 now. This is going to be Peter Kerpotkin. So this is, I guess, the godfather of Anarcho-Communism. Oh boy, oh boy. Fun times. But there's good stuff coming later in the book that I want to get to. So we're going to do that. What's up, Fallstar? Okay. Chapter 12. Peter Kerpotkin. This is an excerpt from Conquest of Bread, published in 1892. Introduction by Michael Malice is as follows. No one has done as much to flesh out what anarcho-communism would look like in practice as Peter Kerpotkin. Kerpotkin regarded anarchism as the evolved alternative to the might-makes-right social Darwinist worldview, and is quoted as saying, quote, competition is the law of the jungle, but cooperation is the law of civilization. He envisioned a peaceful society where everyone would work to the benefit of all, where kindness and compassion motivated humanity. Despite claims that he was utterly naive, it is violence that is by far the exception in interpersonal human interaction. Kerpotkin's The Conquest of Bread remains the classic text elucidating the ANCOM perspective. All right, here we go. Anarcho-Communism Part One. Every society which has abolished private property will be forced, we maintain, to organize itself on the lines of communistic anarchy. Anarchy leads to communism, and communism to anarchy, both alike being expressions of the predominant tendency in modern societies, the pursuit of equality. Time was when a peasant family could consider the corn which it grew, or the woolen garments woven in the cottage, as the products of its own toil. But even then, this way of looking at things was not quite correct. There were the roads and the bridges made in common, the swamps drained by common toil, and the communal pastures enclosed by ledges which were kept in repair by each and all. If the looms for weaving or the dyes for coloring fabrics were improved, all profited. So, even in those days, a peasant family could not live alone, but was dependent in 1,000 ways on the village or the commune. But nowadays, in the present state of industry, when everything is interdependent, when each brand of production is knit up with all the rest, the attempt to claim an individualist origin for the products of industry is absolutely untenable. The astonishing perfection attained by the textile or mining industries in civilized countries is due to the simultaneous development of 1,000 other industries, great and small, to the extension of the railroad system, to oceanic navigation, to the manual skill of thousands of workers, to a certain standard of culture reached by the working classes as a whole, to the laborers, in short, of men in every corner of the globe. The Italians who died of cholera while making the Suez Canal, of ankylosis in the St. Gothard Tunnel, and the Americans mowed down by shot and shell while fighting for the abolition of slavery have helped to develop the cotton industry in France and England, as well as the work girls who languish in the factories of Manchester and Rouen. And the inventor who, following the suggestion of some worker, succeeds in improving the looms. How then shall we estimate the share of each in the riches which all contribute to amass? Looking at production from this general synthetic point of view, we cannot hold with the collectivists that payment proportionate to the hours of labor rendered by each would be an ideal arrangement, or even a step in the right direction. Without discussing whether exchange value of goods is really measured in existing societies by the amount of work necessary to produce it, according to the doctrine of Smith and Ricardo, in whose footsteps Marx has followed, suffice it to say here, leaving ourselves free to return to the subject later, that the collectivist ideal appears to us untenable in a society which considers the instruments of labor as a common inheritance. Starting from this principle, such a society would find itself forced from the very outset to abandon all forms of wages. The mitigated individualism of the collectivist system certainly could not maintain itself alongside a partial communism. The socialization of land and the instruments of production, a new form of property requires a new form of remuneration. A new method of production cannot exist side by side with the old forms of consumption, any more than it can adapt itself to the old forms of political organization. The wage system arises out of the individual ownership of the land and the instruments of labor. It was the necessary condition for the development of capitalist production and will perish with it, in spite of the attempt to disguise it as profit sharing. The common possession of the instruments of labor must necessarily bring with it the enjoyment in common of the fruits of common labor. We hold further that communism is not only desirable, but that existing societies founded on individualism are inevitably impelled in the direction of communism. The development of individualism during the last 3 centuries is explained by the efforts of the individual to protect himself from the tyranny of capital and of the state. For a time he imagined, and those who expressed his thought for him declared, that he could free himself entirely from the state and from society, quote, "By means of money," he said, "I can buy all that I need." But the individual was on a wrong tack. A modern history has taught him to recognize that without the help of all, he can do nothing, although his strong boxes are full of gold. What? In fact, alongside this current of individualism, we find in all modern history a tendency, on the one hand, to retain all that remains of the partial communism of antiquity, and on the other, to establish the communist principle in the 1,000 developments of modern life. As soon as the communes of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries had succeeded in emancipating themselves from their lords, ecclesiastical or lay, their communal labor and communal consumption began to extend and develop rapidly. The township, and not private persons, freighted ships and equipped expeditions, and the benefit arising from the foreign trade did not accrue to individuals, but was shared by all. The townships also bought provisions for their citizens. Traces of these institutions have lingered on into the 19th century, and the folk piously cherish the memory of them in their legends. All that has disappeared, but the rural township still struggles to preserve the last traces of this communism, and it succeeds, except when the state throws its heavy sword into the balance. Meanwhile, new organizations based on the same principle, to every man according to his needs, spring up under 1,000 different forms, for without a certain leaven of communism, the present societies could not exist. In spite of the narrowly egoistic turn given to men's minds by the commercial system, the tendency towards communism is constantly appearing, and influences our activities in a variety of ways. The bridges, for the use of which a toll was levied in the old days, are now become public property and free to all. So are the high roads, except in the East, where a toll is still exacted from the traveler for every mile of his journey. Museums, free libraries, free schools, free meals for children, parks and gardens open to all, streets paved and lighted, free to all, water supplied to every house without measure or stint. All such arrangements are founded on the principle, take what you need. Yeah, it's just free, guys. Just free to all. Take what you need. It's free. Free libraries. They're just free. It's all good. The tramways and railways have already introduced monthly and annual season tickets, without limiting the number of journeys taken. And two nations, Hungary and Russia, have introduced on their railways the zone system, which permits the holder to travel 500 or 1,000 miles for the same price. It is but a short step from that to a uniform charge, such as already prevails in the postal service. In all these innovations and 1,000 others, the tendency is not to measure the individual consumption. One man wants to travel 1,000 miles, another 500. These are personal requirements. There is no sufficient reason why one should pay twice as much as the other, because his need is twice as great. What? Such are the signs which appear even now in our individualist societies. There's no sufficient reason why one should pay twice as much as the other because he needs to travel twice as far. There's no sufficient reason? Okay. Moreover, there is a tendency, though still a feeble one, to consider the needs of the individual, irrespective of his past or possible services to the community. We are beginning to think of society as a whole, each part of which is so intimately bound up with the others that a service rendered to one is a service rendered to all. When you go into a public library, not indeed the National Library of Paris, but, say, into the British Museum or the Berlin Library, the librarian does not ask what services you have rendered to society before giving you the book, or the 50 books which you require, and he comes to your assistance if you do not know how to manage the catalog. By means of uniform credentials, and very often a contribution of work is preferred, the scientific society opens its museums, its gardens, its library, its laboratories, and its annual Oh, wow. That's a new one. Conversations. I'm moving on. I'm not looking that one up. To each of its members, whether he be a Darwin or a simple amateur. At St. Petersburg, if you are pursuing an invention, you go into a special laboratory or a workshop, where you are given a place, a carpenter's bench, a turning lathe, all the necessary tools and scientific instruments, provided only you know how to use them, and you are allowed to work there as long as you please. There are the tools, interests others in your idea. Join with fellow workers skilled in various crafts, or work alone if you prefer it. Invent a flying machine or invent nothing. That is your own affair. You are pursuing an idea. That is enough. Like a baby. Like a child's understanding of resource allocation and efficiency. In the same way, those who man the lifeboat do not ask credentials from the crew of a sinking ship. They launch their boat, risk their lives in the raging waves, and sometimes perish, all to save men whom they do not even know. And what need to know them? Quote, they are human beings, and they need our aid. That is enough. That establishes their right to the rescue. Thus we find a tendency eminently communistic springing up on all sides, and in various guises, in the very heart of theoretically individualist societies. End quote. Suppose that one of our great cities, so egotistic in ordinary times, were visited tomorrow by some calamity, a siege, for instance. That same selfish city would decide that the first needs to satisfy were those of the children and the aged. Without asking what services they had rendered or were likely to render to society, it would first of all feed them. Then the combatants would be cared for, irrespective of the courage or the intelligence with which each has displayed, and thousands of men and women would outvie each other in unselfish devotion to the wounded. This tendency, exists and is felt as soon as the most pressing needs of each are satisfied, and in proportion as the productive power of the race increases. It becomes an active force every time a great idea comes to oust the mean preoccupations of everyday life. How can we doubt, then, that when the instruments of production are placed at the service of all, when business is conducted on communist principles, when labor, having recovered its place of honor in society, produces much more than is necessary to all? When has that ever happened? How can we doubt but that this force, already so powerful, will enlarge its sphere of action till it becomes the ruling principle of social life? Following these indications and considering further the practical side of expropriation, of which we shall speak in the following chapters, we are convinced that our first obligation, when the revolution shall have broken the power upholding the present system, will be to realize communism without delay. But ours is neither the communism of Fourier and the Phalansterians, nor of the German state socialists. It is anarchist communism, communism without government, the communism of the free. It is the synthesis of the two ideals pursued by humanity throughout the ages, economic and political liberty. Part 2. In taking anarchy for our ideal of political organization, we are only giving expression to another marked tendency of human progress. Whenever European societies have developed up to a certain point, they have shaken off the yoke of authority and substituted a system founded roughly more or less on the principles of individual liberty. And history shows us that these periods of partial or general revolution, when the governments were overthrown, were also periods of sudden progress both in the economic and the intellectual field. Now, it is the enfranchisement of the communes whose monuments produced by the free labor of the guilds have never been surpassed. Now it is the peasant rising which brought about the Reformation and imperiled the papacy. And then again, it is the society, free for a brief space, which was created at the other side of the Atlantic by the malcontents from the Old World. Further, if we observe the present development of civilized people, we see most unmistakably a movement ever more and more marked to limit the sphere of action of the government, and to allow more and more liberty to the individual. This evolution is going on before our eyes, though cumbered by the ruins and rubbish of old institutions and old superstitions. Like all evolutions, it only waits a revolution to overthrow the old obstacles which block the way, that it may find free scope in a regenerated society. After having striven long in vain to solve the insoluble problem, the problem of constructing a government, quote, which will constrain the individual to obedience without itself ceasing to be the servant of society, end quote, men at last attempt to free themselves from every form of government and to satisfy their need for organization by a free contract between individuals and groups pursuing the same aim. The independence of each small territorial unit becomes a pressing need. Mutual agreement replaces law, and everywhere regulates individual interests in view of a common object. All that was once looked on as a function of the government is today called in question. Things are arranged more easily and more satisfactorily without the intervention of the state, and in studying the progress made in this direction, we are led to conclude that the tendency of the human race is to reduce government interference to zero. In fact, to abolish the state, the personification of injustice, oppression, and monopoly. We can already catch glimpses of a world in which the bonds which bind the individual are no longer laws, but social habits. The result of the need felt by each one of us to seek the support, the cooperation, the sympathy of his neighbors. Assuredly, the idea of a society without a state will give rise to at least as many objections as the political economy of a society without private capital. We have all been brought up from our childhood to regard the state as a sort of providence. All our education, The Roman history we learned at school, the Byzantine code which we studied later under the name of Roman law, and the various sciences taught at the universities, accustom us to believe in government, and in the virtues of the state providential. To maintain this superstition, whole systems of philosophy have been elaborated and taught. All politics are based on this principle, and each politician, whatever his colors, comes forward and says to the people, quote, "Give me the power, and I both can and will free you from the miseries which press so heavily upon you." End quote. From the cradle to the grave, all our actions are guided by this principle. Open any book on sociology or jurisprudence, and you will find there the government, its organization, its acts, filling so large a place that we come to believe that there is nothing outside the government and the world of statesmen. The press teaches us the same in every conceivable way. Whole columns are devoted to parliamentary debates and to political intrigues. The vast everyday life of a nation is barely mentioned in a few lines when dealing with economic subjects, law, or in diverse facts relating to police cases. And when you read these newspapers, you hardly think of the incalculable number of beings, all humanity, so to say, who grow up and die, who know sorrow, who work and consume, think and create outside the few encumbering personages who have been so magnified that humanity is hidden by their shadows, enlarged by our ignorance. And yet, as soon as we pass from printed matter to life itself, as soon as we throw a glance at society, we are struck by the infinitesimal part played by the government. Balzac already remarked how millions of peasants spend the whole of their lives without knowing anything about the state, save the heavy taxes they are compelled to pay. Every day, millions of transactions are made without government intervention, and the greatest of them, those of commerce and of the exchange, are carried on in such a way that the government could not be appealed to if one of the contracting parties had the intention of not fulfilling his agreement. Should you speak to a man who understands commerce, he will tell you that the everyday business transacted by merchants would be absolutely impossible were it not based on mutual confidence. The habit of keeping his word, the desire not to lose his credit, amply suffice to maintain this relative honesty. The man who does not feel the slightest remorse when poisoning his customers with noxious drugs covered with pompous labels thinks he is in honor bound to keep his engagements. Now, if this relative morality has developed under present conditions when enrichment is the only incentive and the only aim, can we doubt its rapid progress when appropriation of the fruits of others' labor will no longer be the basis of society? Oh, these poor bastards. Another striking fact, which especially characterizes our generation, speaks still more in favor of our ideas. It is the continual extension of the field of enterprise due to private initiative, and the prodigious development of free groups of all kinds. We shall discuss this more at length in the chapter devoted to free agreement. Suffice it to mention that the facts are so numerous and so customary that they are the essence of the second half of the 19th century, even though political and socialist writers ignore them, always preferring to talk to us about the functions of government. These organizations, free and infinitely varied, are so natural an outcome of our civilization, they expand so rapidly and group themselves with so much ease, that they are so necessary a result of the continual growth of the needs of civilized man, and lastly, they so advantageously replace governmental interference that we must recognize them a factor of growing importance in the life of societies. That was one sentence. If they do not yet spread over the whole of the manifestations of life, it is that they find an insurmountable obstacle in the poverty of the worker, in the castes of present society, in the private appropriation of capital, and in the state. Abolish these obstacles, and you will see them covering the immense field of civilized man's activity. The history of the last 50 years furnishes a living proof that representative government is impotent to discharge the functions we have sought to assign to it. In days to come, the 19th century will be quoted as having witnessed the failure of parliamentarianism. Oh, yeah? I wish. But this impotence is becoming evident to all. The faults of parliamentarianism and the inherent vices of the representative principle are self-evident, and the few thinkers who have made a critical study of them, J.S. Mill and Leverdays, but did give literary form to the popular dissatisfaction. It is not difficult indeed to see the absurdity of naming a few men and saying to them, quote, "Make laws regulating all our spheres of activity, although not one of you knows anything about them," end quote. We are beginning to see that government by majorities means abandoning all the affairs of the country to the tide waiters who make up the majorities in the House and in election committees, to those, in a word, who have no opinion of their own, but mankind is seeking and already finding new issues. The International Postal Union, the railway unions, and the learned societies give us examples of solutions based on free agreement in place instead of law. Today, when groups scattered far and wide wish to organize themselves for some object or another, they no longer elect an international parliament of jacks of all trades. No. Where it is not possible to meet directly or come to an agreement by correspondence, delegates versed in the question at issue are sent to treat with the instructions, "Endeavor to come to an agreement on such or such a question, and then return not with a law in your pocket, but with a proposition of agreement which we may or may not accept." Such is the method of the great industrial companies, the learned societies, and the associations of every description, which already cover Europe and the United States. And such should be the method of an emancipated society. While bringing about expropriation, society cannot continue to organize itself on the principle of parliamentary representation. A society founded on serfdom is in keeping with absolute monarchy. A society based on the wage system and the exploitation of the masses by the capitalists finds its political expression in parliamentarianism. But a free society, regaining possession of the common inheritance, must seek in free groups and free federations of groups a new government, I meant organization, in harmony with the new economic phase of history. Totally not a government, I promise, TM. Every economic phase has a political phase corresponding to it, and it would be impossible to touch property without finding at the same time a new mode of political life. All right. Expropriation Part One. How much more of this is in this book? Oh, God. Okay. It is told of Rothschild that, seeing his fortune threatened by the Revolution of 1848, he hit upon the following stratagem. Quote, "I am quite willing to admit," said he, "that my fortune has been accumulated at the expense of others, but if it were divided tomorrow among the millions of Europe, the share of each would only amount to 5 shillings. Very well, then, I undertake to render to each his 5 shillings if he asks me for it." Having given due publicity to his promise, our millionaire proceeded as usual to stroll quietly through the streets of Frankfurt. 3 or 4 passers-by asked for their 5 shillings, which he dispersed with a sardonic smile. His stratagem succeeded, and the family of the millionaire is still in possession of his wealth. It is in much the same fashion that the shrewds head among the middle classes reason when they say, quote, "Ah, expropriation! I know what that means. You take all the overcoats and lay them in a heap, and every one is free to help himself and fight for the best." But such jests are irrelevant as well as flippant. What we want is not a redistribution of overcoats, although it must be said that even in such a case the shivering folk would see advantage in it. Nor do we want to divide up the wealth of the Rothschilds. What we do want is so to arrange things that every human being born into the world shall be ensured the opportunity in the first instance of learning some useful occupation and of becoming skilled in it. Next, that he shall be free to work at his trade without asking leave of master or owner, and without handing over to landlord or capitalist the lion's share of what he produces. As to the wealth held by the Rothschilds or the Vanderbilts, it will serve us to organize our system of communal production. The day when the laborer may till the ground without paying away half of what he produces, the day when the machines necessary to prepare the soil for rich harvests are at the free disposal of the cultivators, free machines, the day when the worker in the factory produces for the community and not the monopolist, that day will see the workers clothed and fed, and there will be no more Rothschilds or other exploiters. Yeah, the monopolist really wants, 100 tons of wheat, right? He just wants to sit on the pile of wheat. He's definitely not going to sell it to the community to, feed people. Yes, Durden. This is the chapter in the book. A communist did write this. This is the one of the fundamental communists, anarcho-communist Peter Kerpotkin. This is from The Conquest of Bread. This is all commie right now. No one will then have to sell his working power for a wage that only represents a fraction of what he produces. So far, so good, say our critics, but you will have Rothschilds coming in from outside. How are you to prevent a person from amassing millions in China and then settling amongst you? How are you going to prevent such a one from surrounding himself with lackeys and wage slaves, from exploiting them and enriching himself at their expense? You cannot bring about a revolution all over the world at the same time. Well, then, are you going to establish custom houses on your frontiers to search all who enter your country and confiscate the money they bring with them? Anarchist policemen firing on travelers would be a fine spectacle. But at the root of this argument, there is a great error. Those who propound it have never paused to inquire whence come the fortunes of the rich. A little thought would, however, suffice to show them that these fortunes have their beginnings in the poverty of the poor. When there are no longer any destitute, there will no longer be any rich to exploit them. Let us glance for a moment at the Middle Ages, when great fortunes began to spring up. A feudal baron seizes on a fertile valley. But as long as the fertile valley is empty of folk, our baron is not rich. His land brings him in nothing. He might as well possess a property in the moon. What does our baron do to enrich himself? He looks out for peasants, for poor peasants. If every peasant farmer had a piece of land free from rent and taxes, if he had in addition the tools and the stock necessary for farm labor, who would plow the lands of the baron? Everyone would look after his own. But there are thousands of destitute persons ruined by wars or drought or pestilence. They have neither horse nor plow. Iron was costly in the Middle Ages, and a draught horse still more so. All these destitute creatures are trying to better their condition. One day they see on the road at the confines of our baron's estate a notice board indicating, by certain signs adapted to their comprehension, that the laborer who is willing to settle on this estate will receive the tools and materials to build his cottage and sow his fields, and a portion of land rent-free for a certain number of years. The number of years is represented by so many crosses on the signboard, and the peasant understands the meaning of these crosses. So, the poor wretches swarm over the baron's lands, making roads, draining marshes, building villages. In 9 years he begins to tax them. 5 years later he increases the rent. Then he doubles it. The peasant accepts these new conditions because he cannot find better ones elsewhere, and little by little, with the aid of laws made by the barons, the poverty of the peasant becomes the source of the landlord's wealth. And it is not only the lord of the manor who preys upon him. A whole host of usurers swoop down upon the villages, multiplying as the wretchedness of the peasants increases. That is how things went in the Middle Ages. As today, it is not still the same thing. and today, is it not still the same thing? If there were free lands which the peasant could cultivate if he pleased, would he pay £50 to some, quote, shabble of a duke for condescending to sell him a scrap? Would he burden himself with a lease which absorbed a third of the produce? Would he, on the incomprehensible word system, consent to give the half of his harvest to the landowner? But he has nothing, so he will accept any conditions, if only he can keep body and soul together while he tills the soil and enriches the landlord. So in the 19th century, just as in the Middle Ages, the poverty of the peasant is a source of wealth to the landed proprietor. I guess the main problem with that entire situation was that the land was acquired through force, so it wasn't valid ownership. So to a large degree, we can't disagree with this scenario. But if the land was properly owned, then there's nothing to object to here. Chapter 2, or Part 2, or whatever the hell we're on. The landlord owes his riches to the poverty of the peasants, and the wealth of the capitalist comes from the same source. Take the case of a citizen of the middle class, who somehow or other finds himself in possession of £20,000. He could, of course, spend his money at the rate of £2,000 a year, a mere bagatelle in these days of fantastic, senseless luxury, but then he would have nothing left at the end of 10 years. So, being a practical person, he prefers to keep his fortune intact and win for himself a snug little annual income as well. This is very easy in our society, for the good reason that the towns and villages swarm with workers who have not the wherewithal to live for a month or even a fortnight. Okay, I want to compare paragraphs now. So if we go to the previous page, he said if every peasant farmer had a piece of land free from rent and taxes, and if he had in addition the tools and the stock necessary for farm labor, who would plow the lands of the baron? Everyone would look after his own. And then in the paragraph we just read, this is very easy in our society for the good reason that the towns and villages swarm with workers who have not the wherewithal to live for a month or even a fortnight. Which is it? So, our worthy citizen starts a factory. The banks hasten to lend him another £20,000, especially if he has a reputation for business ability, and with this round sum he can command the labor of 500 hands. If all the men and women in the countryside had their daily bread sure and their daily needs already satisfied for free, magic, who would work for our capitalist at a wage of half a crown a day, while the commodities one produces in a day sell in the market for a crown or more? Unhappily, we know it all too well. The poor quarters of our towns and the neighboring villages are full of needy wretches whose children clamor for bread. So, before the factory is well finished, the workers hasten to offer themselves. Where 100 are required, 300 besiege the doors, and from the time his mill is started, the owner, if he only has average business capacities, will clear £40 a year out of each mill hand he employs. He is thus able to so there's like 3 times as many people wanting a job as he has jobs to give them. Yeah, this definitely is his fault. He is thus able to lay by a snug little fortune. And if he chooses a lucrative trade and has business talents, he will soon increase his income by doubling the number of the men he exploits, the ones that were begging for him to exploit them. So he becomes a personage of importance and can afford to give dinners to other personages, to the local magnates, the civic, legal, and political dignitaries. With his money, he can, quote, marry money. By and by, he may pick and choose places for his children, and later on perhaps get something good from the government, a contract for the army or for the police. His gold breeds gold, till at last a war, or even a rumor of a war, or the speculation on the stock exchange gives him his great opportunity. 9/10 of the great fortunes made in the United States are, as Henry George has shown in his social problems, the result of knavery on a large scale, assisted by the state. In Europe, 9/10 of the fortunes made in our monarchies are republics, and republics have the same origin. There are not two ways of becoming a millionaire. This is the secret of wealth. Find the starving and destitute, pay them half a crown, and make them produce 5 shillings worth in the day, amass a fortune by these means, and then increase it by some lucky hit made with the help of the state. Need we go on to speak of small fortunes attributed by the economists to forethought and frugality, when we know that mere saving in itself brings in nothing, so long as the pence saved are not used to exploit the famishing? Take a shoemaker, for instance. Grant that his work is well paid, that he has plenty of custom, and that by dint of strict frugality he contrives to lay by from 18 pence to 2 shillings a day, perhaps £2 a month. Grant that our shoemaker is never ill, that he does not half starve himself, in spite of his passion for economy, that he does not marry, or that he has no children, that he does not die of consumption. Suppose anything and everything you please. Well, at the age of 50 he will not have scraped together £800, and he will not have enough to live on during his old age, when he is past work. Assuredly, this is not how great fortunes are made. But suppose our shoemaker, as soon as he is laid by, so if if you just put your money in a bag under your bed, it's not going to grow very much. You got to put it to work for you, just like the people he's complaining about do. Assuredly, this is not how great fortunes are made. But suppose our shoemaker, as soon as he has laid by a few pence, thriftily conveys them to the savings bank, and that the savings bank lends them to the capitalist who is just about to employ labor, i.e., to exploit the poor. Then our shoemaker takes an apprentice, the child of some poor wretch, who will think himself lucky if in 5 years' time his son has learned the trade and is able to earn his living. Meanwhile, our shoemaker does not lose by him, and if trade is brisk, he soon takes a second, then a third apprentice. By and by he will take 2 or 3 working men, poor wretches, thankful to receive half a crown a day for work that is worth 5 shillings. And if our shoemaker is in luck, that is to say, he is keen enough and mean enough, his working men and apprentices will bring him in nearly £1 a day, over and above the product of his own toil. He can then enlarge his business. He will gradually become rich and no longer have any need to stint himself in the necessities of life. He will leave a snug little fortune to his son. That is what people call, quote, being economical and having frugal, temperate habits. At bottom, it is nothing more nor less than grinding the face of the poor. Commerce seems an exception to this rule. Such a man, we are told, buys tea in China, brings it to France, and realizes a profit of 30% on his original outlay. He has exploited nobody. Nevertheless, the case is analogous. If our merchant had carried his bales on his back, well and good. In early medieval times, that was exactly how foreign trade was conducted, and so no one reached such giddy heights of fortune as in our days. Very few and very hardly earned were the gold coins which the medieval merchant gained from a long and dangerous voyage. It was less the love of money than the thirst of travel and adventure that inspired his undertakings. Nowadays, the method is simpler. A merchant who has some capital need not stir from his desk to become wealthy. He telegraphs to an agent telling him to buy 100 tons of tea. He freights a ship, and in a few weeks, in 3 months if it is a sailing ship, the vessel brings him his cargo. He does not even take the risks of the voyage, for his tea and his vessel are insured. For free, right? Yeah, like the vessel, the ship is free. All the people that sail it for him are free. The insurance is free. It's just no risk to him at all. He's not risking any money. There's no opportunity cost involved. This is complete ignorance of business. It's complete ignorance. And if he has expended £4,000, he will receive more than 5,000. That is to say, if he has not attempted to speculate in some novel commodities, in which case he runs a chance of either doubling his fortune or losing it altogether. No, like, the tea could go rotten on the boat on the way over, and then he only gets the insurance payout. Or he gets the shipment of tea, and the price of tea has dropped over the month it took the ship to get the tea to him, and he loses money. There's risk involved. Anyway. Now, how could he find men willing to cross the sea, to travel to China and back, to endure hardship and slavish toil, and to risk their lives for a miserable pittance? How could he find dock laborers willing to load and unload his ship for starvation wages? How? Because they are needy and starving. Go to the seaports, visit the cook shops and taverns on the quays, and look at these men who have come to hire themselves, crowding round the dock gates, which they besiege from early dawn, hoping to be allowed to work on the vessels. Look at these sailors, happy to be hired for a long voyage, after weeks and months of waiting. All their lives long they have gone to the sea in ships, and they will sail in others still until they have perished in the waves. Enter their homes, look at their wives and children in rags, living one knows not how till the father's return, and you will have the answer to the question. I think the answer to the question was the difference in what the shoemaker did in the first example and the second example. If you make smarter decisions with your resources, plan ahead, make your resources work for you instead of just trying to stuff them in a bag, then you won't be working the docks your entire life. Well, there were a lot of coercive institutions in this time, so this is not a one-to-one, but yeah, I hopefully I've made my point. Multiply examples, choose them where you will, consider the origin of all fortunes, large or small, whether arising out of commerce, finance, manufacturers, or the land. Everywhere you will find that the wealth of the wealthy springs from the poverty of the poor. This is why an anarchist society need not fear the advent of a Rothschild who would settle in its midst. If every member of the community knows that after a few hours of productive toil he will have a right to all the pleasures that civilization procures, and to those deeper sources of enjoyment which art and science offer to all who seek them, he will not sell his strength for a starvation wage. No one will volunteer to work for the enrichment of your Rothschild. His golden guineas will be only so many pieces of metal, useful for various purposes, but incapable of breeding more. In answering the above objection, we have at the same time indicated the scope of expropriation. It must apply to everything that enables any man, be he financier, mill owner, or landlord, to appropriate the product of others' toil. Our formula is simple and comprehensive. We do not want to rob any one of his coat, but we wish to give to the workers all those things the lack of which makes them fall an easy prey to the exploiter, and we will do our utmost that none shall lack aught, that not a single man shall be forced to sell the strength of his right arm to attain bare subsistence for himself and his babes. This is what we mean when we talk of expropriation. This will be our duty during the Revolution, for whose coming we look not 200 years hence, but soon, very soon. Part 3. The ideas of anarchism in general, and of expropriation in particular, find much more sympathy than we are apt to imagine among men of independent character, and those for whom idleness is not the supreme ideal. Still, our friends often warn us, quote, "Take care you do not go too far. Humanity cannot be changed in a day, so do not be in too great a hurry with your schemes of expropriation and anarchy, or you will be in danger of achieving no permanent result." Now, what we fear with regard to expropriation is exactly the contrary. We are afraid of not going far enough, of carrying out expropriation on too small a scale to be lasting. We would not have this revolutionary impulse arrested in mid-career to exhaust itself in half measures which would content no one, and while producing a tremendous confusion in society and stopping its customary activities, would have no vital power, would merely spread general discontent and inevitably prepare the way for the triumph of reaction. There are, in fact, in a modern state established relations which it is practically impossible to modify if one attacks them only in detail. There are wheels within wheels in our economic organization. The machinery is so complex and interdependent that no one part can be modified without disturbing the whole. This becomes clear as soon as an attempt is made to expropriate anything. Let us suppose that in a certain country a limited form of expropriation is effected. For example, that, as it had been suggested more than once, only the property of the great landlords is socialized, while the factories are left untouched. Or that in a certain city, house property is taken over by the commune. It totally doesn't sound like a government at all. There's no government here. Definitely not. But everything else is left in private ownership, or that in some manufacturing center. The factories are communalized, but the land is not interfered with. The same result would follow in each case, a terrible shattering of the industrial system, without the means of reorganizing it on new lines. Industry and finance would be at a deadlock, yet in a return to the first principles of justice would not have been achieved. And society would find itself powerless to construct a harmonious whole. If agriculture could free itself from great landowners while industry still remained the bond slave of the capitalist, the merchant, and the banker, nothing would be accomplished. The peasant suffers today not only in having to pay rent to the landlord, he is oppressed on all hands by existing conditions. He is exploited by the tradesman who makes him pay half a crown for a spade, which, measured by tile labor spent on it, is not worth more than 6 pence. He is taxed by the state, which cannot do without its formidable hierarchy of officials, and finds it necessary to maintain an expensive army, because the traders of all nations are perpetually fighting for markets, and any day a little quarrel arising from the exploitation of some part of Asia or Africa may result in war. Then again, the peasant suffers from the depopulation of country places. The young people are attracted to the large manufacturing towns by the bait of high wages paid temporarily by the producers of articles of luxury, or by the attractions of a more stirring life. The artificial protection of industry, the industrial exploitation of foreign countries, the prevalence of stock jobbing, the difficulty of improving the soil and the machinery of production, all these agencies combine nowadays to work against agriculture, which is burdened not only by rent, but by the whole complex of conditions in a society based on exploitation. Thus, even if the expropriation of land were accomplished, and everyone were free to till the soil and cultivate it to the best advantage, which definitely everyone would, without paying rent, agriculture, even though it should enjoy, which can by no means be taken for granted, a momentary prosperity would soon fall back into the slough in which it finds itself today. The whole thing would have to be begun over again with increased difficulties. The same holds true of industry. Take the converse case. Instead of turning the agricultural laborers into peasant proprietors, make over the factories to those who work in them. Abolish the master manufacturers, but leave the landlord his land, the banker his money, the merchant his exchange. Maintain the swarm of idlers who live on the toil of the workmen, the 1,001 middlemen. The state with its numberless officials and industry would come to a standstill. Finding no purchasers in the mass of peasants who would remain poor, not possessing the raw material and unable to export their produce, partly on account of the stoppage of trade and still more so because industries spread all over the world, the manufacturers would feel unable to struggle, and thousands of workers would be thrown upon the streets. These starving crowds would be ready and willing to submit to the finest schemer who came to exploit them. They would even consent to return to the old slavery, if only under promise of work. Or finally, suppose you oust the landowners. Just the hubris of thinking, just like, suppose we just take all of this group of people's property. Well, suppose we instead take this entire group of people's property. This is all insufficient. I'm going to make the case that we should take all of these groups' property. Jesus. Definitely no government here. This is anarchy. Hashtag anarchy. Or, finally, suppose you oust the landowners and hand over the mills and factories to the worker, without interfering with the swarm of middlemen who drain the product of our manufacturers and speculate in corn and flour, meat and groceries in our great centers of commerce. Then, as soon as exchange is arrested, the great cities are left without bread, and others find no buyers for their articles of luxury. A terrible counter-revolution will take place. A counter-revolution treading upon the slain, sweeping the towns and villages with shot and shell. There would be proscriptions, panic, flight, tend all the terrors of the guillotine, as it was in France in 1815, 1848, and 1871. All is interdependent in a civilized society. It is impossible to reform any one thing without altering the whole. Therefore, on the day we strike at private property, under any one of its forms, territorial or industrial, we shall be obliged to attack them all. The very success of the revolution will demand it. Besides, we could not, if we would, confine ourselves to a partial expropriation. Once the principle of the divine right of property is shaken, no amount of theorizing will prevent its overthrow, here by the slaves of the toil, there by the slaves of the machine. If a great town, Paris for example, were to confine itself to taking possession of the dwelling houses or the factories, it would be forced also to deny the right of the bankers to levy upon the commune a tax amounting to £2,000,000 in the form of interest for former loans. The great city would be obliged to put itself in touch with the rural districts, and its influence would inevitably urge the peasants to free themselves from the landowner. It would be necessary to communalize the railways, that the citizens might get food and work, and lastly, to prevent the waste of supplies, and to guard against the trust of corn speculators. Like those to whom the Commune of 1793 fell a prey, it would have to place in the hands of the city the work of stocking its warehouses with commodities and apportioning the produce. Nevertheless, some socialists still seek to establish a distinction. Of course, they say, the soil, the mines, the mills, and manufacturers must be expropriated. These are the instruments of production, and it is right we should consider them public property. But articles of consumption, food, clothes, and dwellings should remain private property." End quote. Popular common sense has got the better of this subtle distinction. We are not savages who can live in the woods without other shelter than the branches. The civilized man needs a roof, a room, a hearth, and a bed. It is true that the bed, the room, and the house is a home of idleness for the non-producer. But for the worker, a room, properly heated and lighted, is as much an instrument of production as the tool or the machine. It is the place where the nerves and sinews gather strength for the work of the morrow. The rest of the workman is the daily repairing of the machine. The same argument applies even more obviously to food. The so-called economists of whom we speak would hardly deny that the coal burnt in a machine is as necessary to production as the raw material itself. How then can food, without which the human machine could do no work, be excluded from the list of things indispensable to the producer? Can this be a relic of religious metaphysics? The rich man's feast is indeed a matter of luxury, but the food of the worker is just as much a part of production as the fuel burnt by the steam engine. The same with clothing. If economists who draw this distinction between articles of production and of consumption dressed themselves in the fashion of New Guinea, we could understand their objection. But men who could not write a word without a shirt on their back are not in a position to draw such a hard and fast line between their shirt and their pen. And though the dainty gowns of their dames must certainly rank as objects of luxury, there is nevertheless a certain quantity of linen, cotton, and woolen stuff which is a necessity of life to the producer. The shirt and shoes in which he goes to his work, his cap, and the jacket he slips on after the day's toil is over, these are as necessary to him as the hammer to the anvil. Whether we like it or not, this is what the people mean by a revolution. As soon as they have made a clean sweep of the government, they will seek first of all to ensure to themselves decent dwellings and sufficient food and clothes, free of capitalist rent. And the people will be right. The methods of the people will be much more in accordance with the science than those of the economists who draw so many distinctions between instruments of production and articles of consumption. The people understand that this is just the point where the revolution ought to begin, and they will lay the foundations of the only economic science worthy the name, a science which might be called, quote, the study of the needs of humanity and of the economic means to satisfy them. Well, at least that is over. Let me get a drink here. Chapter 13. Leo Tolstoy from The Slavery of Our Times in 1900. Intro by Malice. Tolstoy is universally regarded as one of the great novelists of all time, with both War and Peace and Anna Karenina, there we go, still held up as masterpieces of fiction. Few are aware that he was also an explicit, committed anarchist. In his non-fiction, Tolstoy set out to explain how a stateless society is superior, as well as possible mechanisms to transition to such a preferable form of human organization. All right, let's begin. What are governments? Is it possible to exist without governments? The cause of the miserable condition of the workers is slavery. The cause of slavery is legislation. Legislation rests on organized violence. It follows that an improvement in the condition of the people is possible only through the abolition of organized violence. Quote, but organized violence is government, and how can we live without governments? Without governments there will be chaos, anarchy. All the achievements of civilization will perish, and people will revert to their primitive barbarism. End quote. It is usual, not only for those to whom the existing order is profitable, but even for those to whom it is evidently unprofitable, but who are also accustomed to it, they cannot imagine life without governmental violence. To say, we must not dare to touch the existing order of things. The destruction of government will, say they, produce the greatest misfortunes, riot, theft, and murder, till finally the worst men will again seize power and enslave all the good people. But not to mention the fact that all this, i.e., riots, thefts, and murders, followed by the rule of the wicked and the enslavement of the good, all this is what has happened and is happening. The anticipation that the disturbance of the existing order will produce riots and disorder does not prove the present order to be good. Quote, only touch the present order, and the greatest of evils will follow. End quote. Only touch one brick of the 1,000 bricks piled into a narrow column several yards high, and all the bricks will tumble down and smash. But the fact that any brick extracted or any push administered will destroy such a column and smash the bricks certainly does not prove it to be wise to keep the bricks in such an unnatural and inconvenient position. On the contrary, it shows that bricks should not be piled in such a column, but that they should be rearranged so that they may lie firmly, and so that they can be made use of without destroying the whole erection. It is the same with the present state organizations. The state organization is extremely artificial and unstable, and the fact that the least push may destroy it not only does not prove that it is necessary, but, on the contrary, shows that if once upon a time it was necessary, it is now absolutely unnecessary and is therefore harmful and dangerous. It is harmful and dangerous because the effect of this organization on all the evil that exists in society is not to lessen and correct, but rather to strengthen and confirm that evil. It is strengthened and confirmed by being either justified and put in attractive forms or secreted. All that well-being of the people which we see in so-called well-governed states ruled by violence is but an appearance, a fiction. Everything that would disturb the external appearance of well-being, all the hungry people, the sick, the revoltingly vicious, are all hidden away where they cannot be seen. But the fact that we do not see them does not show that they do not exist. On the contrary, the more they are hidden, the more there will be of them, and the more cruel towards them will those be who are the cause of their condition. It is true that every interruption, and yet more, every stoppage of governmental action, i.e. of organized violence, disturb this external appearance of well-being in our life. But such disturbance does not produce disorder, but merely displays what was hidden, and makes possible its amendment. Until now, say till almost the end of the 19th century, people thought and believed that they could not live without governments. But life flows onward, and the conditions of life and people's views change. And notwithstanding the efforts of governments to keep people in that childish condition in which an injured man feels as if it were better for him to have someone to complain to, people, especially the laboring people, both in Europe and in Russia, are more and more emerging from childhood and beginning to understand the true conditions of their life. Quote, "You tell us but that for you we shall be conquered by neighboring nations, by the Chinese or the Japanese," men of the people now say, "but we read the papers, and know that no one is threatening to attack us, and that it is only you who govern us who, for some aims unintelligible to us, exasperate each other, and then, under pretense of defending your own people, ruin us with taxes for the maintenance of the fleet, for armaments, or for strategical railways which are only required to gratify your ambition and vanity. And then you arrange wars with one another, as you have now done against the peaceful Chinese. You say that you defend landed property for our advantage, but your defense has this effect, that all the land either has passed or is passing into the control of rich banking companies, which do not work, while we, the immense majority of the people, are being deprived of land and left in the power of those who do not labor. You, with your laws of landed property, do not defend landed property, but take it from those who work it. You say you secure to each man the produce of his labor, but you do just the reverse. All those who produce articles of value are, thanks to your pseudo-protection, placed in such a position that they not only never receive the value of their labor, but all are their lives long in complete subjection to and in the power of non-workers." End quote. Thus do people, at the end of the century, begin to understand and to speak, and this awakening from the lethargy in which governments have kept them is going on in some rapidly increasing ratio. Within the last 5 or 6 years, the public opinion of the common folk, not only in the towns, but in the villages, and not only in Europe, but also among us in Russia, has altered amazingly. It is said that without governments we should not have those institutions, enlightening, educational, and public, that are needful for all. But why should we suppose this? Why think that non-official people could not arrange their life themselves as well as government people arrange it, not for themselves, but for others? We see, on the contrary, that in the most diverse matters, people in our times arrange their own lives incomparably better than those who govern them arrange for them. Without the least help from government, and often in spite of the interference of government, people organize all sorts of social undertakings: workmen's unions, cooperative societies, railway companies, artels, and syndicates. If collections for public works are needed, why should we suppose that free people could not, without violence, voluntarily collect the necessary means and carry out all that is carried out by means of taxes, if only the undertakings in question are really useful for everybody? Why suppose that there cannot be tribunals without violence? Trial by people trusted by the disputants has always existed and will exist and needs no violence. We are so depraved by long-continued slavery that we can hardly imagine administration without violence. And yet again, this is not true. Russian communes, migrating to distant regions where our government leaves them alone, arrange their own taxation, administration, tribunals, and police, and always prosper, until government violence interferes with their administration. And in the same way, there is no reason to suppose that people could not, by common consent, decide how the land is to be apportioned for use. I have known people, Cossacks of the Ural, who have lived without acknowledging private property in land, and there was such well-being and order in their commune as not to exist in society, where landed property is defended by violence. And I now know communes that live without acknowledging the right of individuals to private property. Within my recollection, the whole Russian peasantry did not accept the idea of landed property. The defense of landed property by governmental violence not merely does not abolish the struggle for landed property, but, on the contrary, strengthens that struggle, and in many cases causes it. Were it not for the defense of landed property and its consequent rise in price, people would not be crowded into such narrow spaces, but would scatter over the free land of which there is still so much in the world. But, as it is, a continual struggle goes on for landed property, a struggle with the weapons governments furnish by means of its laws of landed property. And in this struggle it is not those who work on the land, but always those who take part in governmental violence that have the advantage. It is the same with reference to things produced by labor. Things recently produced by a man's own labor, and that he needs, are always defended by custom, by public opinion, by feelings of justice and reciprocity, and they do not need to be protected by violence. Tens of thousands of acres of forest lands belonging to one proprietor, while thousands of people close by have no fuel, need protection by violence. So too do factories and works where several generations of workmen have been defrauded, are still being defrauded. Yet more do hundreds of thousands of bushels of grain belonging to one owner who has held them back till a famine has come to sell them at triple price. But no man, however depraved, except a rich man or a government official, would take from a countryman living by his own labor the harvest he has raised or the cow he has bred, and from which he gets milk for his children, or the succus? The scythes and the spades he has made and uses. If even a man were found who did take from another articles the latter had made and required, such a man would rouse against himself such indignation from everyone living in similar circumstances that he would hardly find his action profitable for himself. A man so immoral as to do it under such circumstances would be sure to do it under the strictest system of property defense by violence. It is generally said, quote, "Only attempt to abolish the rights of property in land and in the produce of labor, and no one will take the trouble to work, lacking the assurance that he will not be deprived of what he has produced." End quote. We should say just the opposite. The defense by violence of the rights of property immorally obtained, which is now customary, if it is not quite destroyed, has considerably weakened people's natural consciousness of justice in the matter of using articles, i.e., the natural and innate right of property, without which humanity could not exist, and which has always existed and still exists among all men. And therefore there is no reason to anticipate that people will not be able to arrange their lives without organized violence. Of course, it may be said that horses and bulls must be guided by the violence of rational beings, men. But why must men be guided, not by some higher beings, but by people such as themselves? Why ought people to be subject to the violence of just those people who are in power at a given time? What proves that these people are wiser than those on whom they inflict violence? The fact that they allow themselves to use violence toward human beings indicates that they are not only not more wise, but are less wise than those who submit to them. The examinations in China for the office of mandarin do not, we know, ensure that the wisest and best people should be placed in power, and just as little is this ensured by inheritance, or the whole machinery of promotions in rank, or the elections in constitutional countries. On the contrary, power is always seized by those who are less conscientious and less moral. It is said, quote, "How can people live without governments, i.e., without violence?" End quote. But it should, on the contrary, be asked, Quote, how can people who are rational live, acknowledging that the vital bond of their social life is violence and not reasonable agreement? One of two things. Either people are rational beings, or they are irrational beings. If they are irrational beings, then they are all irrational, and then everything among them is decided by violence. And there is no reason why certain people should and others should not have a right to use violence. And in that case, governmental violence has no justification. But if men are rational beings, then their relations should be based on reason, and not on the violence of those who happen to have seized power. And in that case, again, governmental violence has no justification. Well, that's a good place to stop for today. Hope you enjoyed this Let's Read. We're about 2/3 of the way through the book. We got a lot of good stuff to come to. So we'll leave it there. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a great evening.